Every runway in the world tells a story, some of triumph, others of tragedy. In aviation, safety is written in lessons learned the hardest way possible. Tonight, we revisit the moments when confusion, fog, and a single misunderstood word changed history forever. From Tenerife to New York, these are the real collisions and near misses that forced the skies to evolve. If you love aviation, history, and the stories that shaped modern flight, make sure to subscribe to Terra Obscura and like this video, because every second in these stories mattered, and so does every one of your clicks. It began on the morning of March 27th, 1977, a day that would change the course of aviation history forever. The island of Tenerife, known for its calm beaches and volcanic ridges, was suddenly overwhelmed with unexpected chaos. It was a modest field, with a single runway, no advanced ground radar, and limited taxiways. It was never designed for the size or number of aircraft now crowding its ramps. Among those diverted were two Boeing 747s, one belonging to KLM Royal Dutch Airlines, Flight 4805, and another from Pan American World Airways, Flight 1736. Each carried hundreds of passengers. Each was flown by experienced, confident crews, and both would soon find themselves trapped in the same deadly fog. The ramp at Los Rodeos filled quickly. Aircraft were parked so closely together that none could depart until others moved. As the afternoon wore on, the tension grew. Passengers waited in terminals that weren't built for crowds this large. Flight crews sat for hours with their engines off, their duty times running dangerously long. When Gran Canaria finally reopened, every pilot wanted to leave immediately. But Los Rodeos had no taxiway parallel to the runway. Planes had to backtrack along the runway itself to take off, one departure at a time. And outside, the weather had begun to change. The fog rolled in from the Atlantic in slow, shifting waves. First it covered the distant hills, then the terminal, then the runway lights. Visibility dropped to a few hundred meters. Radio calls became the only way to know who was where. Controllers couldn't see the planes. Pilots couldn't see each other. The world outside the cockpit turned into a blank, glowing grey. Pan Am 1736, still holding behind KLM, was instructed to follow the Dutch aircraft down the runway and exit via the third taxiway. The plan was simple. KLM would line up and wait, Pan Am would clear the runway, and then takeoff clearance would come. But inside the KLM cockpit, fatigue, impatience, and pride began to mix. Captain Jacob van Zanten was not just a pilot. He was KLM's chief flight instructor, the face of their safety campaigns. He was used to control, precision, and authority. Yet this day, even he was being pushed by delays, duty limits, and worsening weather. When the controller said, "Okay, you are cleared to the takeoff position. Stand by for takeoff. I will call you." Van Zanten heard what he wanted to hear. Cleared for takeoff. His co-pilot hesitated, repeating, "We are now at takeoff." The tower, unaware of the misunderstanding, added, "Okay, stand by for takeoff. I will call you." But another transmission, from Pan Am, overlapped on the same frequency, cutting out part of the message. Neither crew heard everything. The most crucial words vanished into static. The throttles went forward. The four massive engines of the KLM 747 spooled up, shaking the fog. It began to roll, accelerating down the runway, gathering speed toward the invisible horizon. In the Pan Am cockpit, Captain Grubbs and his crew were still taxiing. The third taxiway they were told to exit by wasn't marked clearly. In the fog, they missed it. They were still on the main runway. At first, they heard nothing but engine rumble. Then, out of the grey, the impossible appeared, headlights emerging directly toward them. "Look at that! There he is!" Grubbs shouted. "Get off! Get off!" The Pan Am tried to turn off, full power on its engines. desperate to clear the center line. In the KLM cockpit, the flight engineer's voice cracked. "Is he not clear? That Pan American?" The captain, realizing too late, pulled back on the yoke. The plane began to lift, but it was too soon. Its tail struck the runway, sparks trailing behind. The nose came up, wheels rising just enough to skim over the Pan Am's fuselage. And then, contact. The sound was described as a roar and a scream at once. The KLM sliced through the Pan Am's upper deck, tearing it open. Fire consumed the runway within seconds. The KLM climbed briefly, then fell back in a ball of flames. Every soul aboard perished instantly. The Pan Am, torn apart but not yet destroyed, burned for minutes as survivors clawed their way through the wreckage. Only 61 of its 396 passengers lived. When the flames finally died, 583 people were gone. The deadliest accident in aviation history. No engines failed, no instruments malfunctioned. The cause lay in words, in tone, in human assumption. A single misunderstood clearance, magnified by fatigue, stress, and weather, had destroyed two of the largest aircraft ever built. The legacy of Tenerife would echo for decades. It gave birth to crew resource management, a revolution in cockpit culture, where even the lowest-ranking pilot is encouraged to challenge the captain if something feels wrong. It standardized radio phraseology across the world. Takeoff would never again be spoken until the aircraft was actually cleared to leave the ground. Every time a pilot says, "ready for departure," instead of "ready for takeoff," every time a controller demands a clear readback, it's because of Tenerife. Because on that fog-covered island, aviation learned that perfection in the sky begins with precision on the ground. It was the morning of December 7th, 1983. Dense fog had settled over Madrid Barajas Airport, cloaking the Spanish capital in a heavy, motionless silence. It was a familiar winter fog, thick enough to hide the taxiways, strong enough to blur the runway lights. Controllers could barely see past the glass of the tower. Pilots relied only on instruments, memory, and the radio. It was a day when discipline mattered more than anything else. Two aircraft prepared for departure. The first, an Iberia Boeing 727 operating as Flight 350, was cleared to line up on runway 01. The second, an Aviaco DC-9, Flight 134, was instructed to taxi to a different runway for its own departure. Both crews were calm, experienced, and used to flying in low visibility. But Barajas, like many European airports of that era, lacked modern surface radar. There was no way for controllers to track exactly where each plane was once the fog rolled in. The taxiways at Barajas were complex, weaving and intersecting across the airfield. In clear weather, they were manageable. In fog, they became a labyrinth. Signs were faded, painted lines worn down, and map labeling inconsistent. Even the taxiway lights were dim, scattered unevenly along the path. The Aviaco DC-9 taxied slowly, its pilots straining to make out the next turn, their wipers cutting the moisture off the windshield in rhythmic silence. In the control tower, voices overlapped on the radio. The controllers, juggling multiple aircraft, confirmed clearances, issued instructions, and repeated calls. But one key transmission, a confirmation for the DC-9 to hold short of runway 01, was never fully acknowledged. The fog absorbed both sound and sight, erasing context. Somewhere on that airfield, two aircraft were moving toward the same point without realizing it. The Iberia 727 lined up and began its takeoff roll. The engines howled, water sprayed behind the wheels, and the aircraft accelerated into the mist. Inside the cockpit, the crew focused on their instruments, trusting that the runway ahead was clear. They never saw what waited a few hundred meters ahead. The silhouette of the Aviaco DC-9 stopped on the active runway after taking a wrong turn. At 170 knots, there was no time to react. Out of the fog, A dark shadow appeared in front of them. Too close, too fast. The 727's captain pulled hard on the yoke, trying to lift off early. But the aircraft wasn't ready to fly. Its tail struck the ground, sparks erupting beneath the fuselage. A moment later, the nose gear tore through the DC-9's cabin. The sound of impact shattered the silence of Barajas. Both planes disintegrated in an instant, debris scattered across the wet runway, fire consuming the wreckage. All 42 aboard the DC-9 were killed instantly. On the 727, 51 perished, with just a handful of survivors pulled from the burning remains. As investigators combed through the wreckage, the horror of the event was matched only by its simplicity. Nothing mechanical had failed, only coordination. The fog had blinded everyone, but the absence of ground radar and clear taxiway markings had created a perfect trap. The DC-9 crew thought they were where they should be. The tower thought the runway was clear. The Iberia pilots never had a chance to know otherwise. The final report called for sweeping reforms. Spain introduced low-visibility operations protocols for all major airports, requiring stricter hold-short confirmations, upgraded surface lighting, and mandatory readbacks for every clearance. It also accelerated the adoption of ground radar systems across Europe, technology that would have instantly revealed the DC-9's mistake. Today, every pilot operating in fog owes part of their safety to what was learned in Madrid. Every glowing stop bar light, every surface radar screen, every controller asking for confirmation before crossing a runway, all are echoes of that morning at Barajas, when two airliners shared the same strip of asphalt and paid the ultimate price. Two runways, one mistake, one tragedy that forced aviation to see clearly again, even through the fog. It was December 3rd, 1990, at Detroit Metropolitan Wayne County Airport. The weather that morning was suffocatingly familiar: heavy snow, freezing drizzle, and a fog so dense it swallowed entire aircraft in seconds. On the ground, visibility was measured not in miles, but in feet. Controllers strained to track aircraft through radio reports alone. There was no surface radar, no way to confirm who was where. In that frozen haze, two Northwest jets, both from the same airline, would unknowingly set their paths on a collision course. The first was Northwest Flight 1482, a DC-9 preparing to depart for Pittsburgh. The second, Flight 299, a Boeing 727 bound for Memphis. Both crews were composed of seasoned pilots used to winter operations in Detroit. But the airport's layout was notoriously confusing. Long intersecting taxiways with names that changed mid-route, markings half buried under snow, and signs barely visible in the gloom. Even on clear days, pilots joked that Detroit's ground map looked more like a maze than an airport. In this weather, it was a trap. Flight 1482 began taxiing toward its assigned runway. The captain and first officer squinted through their fogged windows, trying to find taxiway signs. Snow reflected the taxi lights back into the cockpit, turning everything into a glowing blur. Radio chatter filled their headsets, dozens of aircraft requesting de-icing, pushing back, lining up. The DC-9 crew, unsure of their position, made a fateful decision. They turned onto what they thought was the correct taxiway to hold short of the runway. In reality, they had entered the active departure runway itself. Meanwhile, on that same runway, Northwest Flight 299, the 727, had just been cleared for takeoff. The tower, unable to see through the fog, believed the path was clear. The 727 accelerated into the mist, its engines tearing through the silence. In the DC-9 cockpit, the pilots suddenly saw headlights materializing out of nowhere. Two beams cutting through the white curtain, growing larger with impossible speed. "Stop! Stop!" the first officer shouted. The DC-9's captain jammed the brakes, but the aircraft barely had time to slow. The 727 crew, seeing the faint outline of another jet on their runway, tried to veer left, but it was too late. At nearly 160 knots, the Boeing's right wing sliced through the DC-9's fuselage, ripping it open. Fire burst instantly across the cabin. Inside the tower, the controllers heard nothing but chaos, mayday calls, screams, and static. The 727, damaged but still controllable, aborted its takeoff and came to a halt farther down the runway. The DC-9, engulfed in flames, spun violently before stopping near a taxiway intersection. 8 lives were lost in an instant. Others crawled from the wreckage into the snow. When investigators arrived, the truth unfolded slowly. The DC-9 crew had been confused by incomplete taxi instructions and obscured signage. The controller had not required the crew to report when crossing critical taxiways, a step now considered essential during low visibility. The airport lacked a surface movement radar system, meaning no one could see that the DC-9 had wandered onto the active runway. And perhaps most painfully, both crews had been following their training, but the system around them had failed to anticipate how human perception collapses in the fog. The Detroit crash became a wake-up call for American airports. The FAA mandated progressive taxi procedures, requiring controllers to guide aircraft step by step during low-visibility operations. Airports began installing ASDE ground radar systems, allowing controllers to see every plane, even in zero visibility. New runway signage standards were adopted nationwide, brighter, larger, and more logically placed. But beyond the technical reforms, the lesson was human. In conditions where sight fails, assumption becomes deadly. The crews of Northwest 1482 and 299 belonged to the same airline, trusted the same procedures, and yet, through a chain of small, ordinary errors, found themselves sharing the same piece of pavement. Same airline, same airport, same mistake. A tragedy that proved even routine familiarity can be the most dangerous illusion of all. It was the evening of February 1st, 1991. Los Angeles International Airport was blanketed in the orange glow of sunset, the air thick with the usual rhythm of one of the busiest airports in the world. At any given moment, dozens of jets were moving across its runways, some landing, some departing, others taxiing or waiting. The choreography was constant, precise, and unrelenting. But that night, a single overlooked movement would unravel the illusion of perfect control. SkyWest Airlines Flight 5569, a small Fairchild Metroliner commuter aircraft, taxied onto runway 24L and waited for clearance to take off. Its crew, flying for a regional carrier feeding passengers into larger airline routes, followed their checklist calmly. They had done this hundreds of times before. Above them, larger jets thundered down parallel runways, their lights flashing through the dusk. To the controller in the tower, they were just another blip in a sea of motion, one of many small aircraft waiting to depart. At the same time, US Air Flight 1493, a Boeing 737 carrying 89 people, was descending toward Los Angeles after a short flight from Columbus, Ohio. The approach was uneventful, routine. The captain, a veteran with thousands of hours, guided the jet through a gentle descent, lined up perfectly with runway 24L, the same runway where SkyWest 5569 still waited. In the control tower, fatigue was setting in. The controllers were handling both arrivals and departures simultaneously, their workload climbing with every transmission. One minor assumption, a mental shortcut taken in a moment of pressure, would prove catastrophic. The controller believed that runway 24L was clear. In his mind, SkyWest had already taken off. He cleared US Air 1493 to land. The 737 broke through the haze and touched down smoothly, until, seconds later, something flashed in the landing lights. a dark silhouette, impossibly close, directly in its path. It was the SkyWest Metro liner, still sitting on the runway. There was no time to react. At nearly 130 knots, the 737 slammed into the smaller aircraft from behind, crushing it beneath its landing gear. The impact tore open both fuselages, sparks erupting into flame. The Metroliner disintegrated instantly, its remains scattered across the asphalt. The 737 skidded down the runway, metal scraping, flames consuming the cabin. Inside the US Air jet, chaos erupted. Passengers screamed as the cabin filled with smoke. Flight attendants shouted for everyone to stay down, to move toward the exits. The captain, disoriented and bleeding, struggled to stop the aircraft. The plane finally came to rest, its nose leaning off the runway, fire spreading fast. Some passengers escaped through the overwing exits, others were trapped in the smoke. Firefighters reached the wreck within minutes, but for 11 people, it was too late. Everyone aboard the SkyWest aircraft, 12 souls, was lost in an instant. In the aftermath, investigators faced a haunting truth. The collision hadn't been caused by weather, mechanical failure, or miscommunication between pilots. It was a human assumption. A single moment when a controller, managing too many tasks at once, lost track of one airplane on his runway. The National Transportation Safety Board's report was blunt. LAX, one of the world's busiest airports, had no operational ground radar to detect aircraft movements at night or in poor visibility. Controllers relied entirely on visual confirmation, a dangerous practice in complex airspace. There were no stop bar lights, no automated alerts, no system capable of warning that a plane was still on the runway. The tragedy became a turning point for US airport safety. The FAA began installing ASDE-3 and later ASDE-X ground radar systems across major airports, allowing controllers to see every aircraft's exact position in real time. Stop bar lighting systems were introduced at critical intersections, turning red when a runway was active. Procedures for runway crossings and clearances were rewritten to require explicit confirmations, removing guesswork from the equation. But the deeper lesson was psychological. Even in high-precision environments like air traffic control, human minds fill in gaps, assuming that what should have happened did happen. On that February night, one man's mind filled in a single missing step, and two planes collided in the worst possible place. Today, every time a controller confirms runway clear, every time a pilot pauses before entering an active strip of asphalt, it echoes back to Los Angeles, 1991. Because on that runway, one plane landed on another, and the world learned that even the most familiar procedures can hide invisible dangers when one human assumption goes unchallenged. It was November 19th, 1996, a quiet evening in the small farming town of Quincy, Illinois. The sky was dark but calm, the airfield lights of Quincy Municipal Airport glowing faintly against the empty Midwestern plains. There was no control tower here, no radar screen, no air traffic controller watching from above. Pilots relied on themselves and on one another to stay alive. Everything depended on a single radio frequency, the CTAF, the Common Traffic Advisory Frequency, where pilots made self-announced calls about their positions and intentions. It was aviation stripped to its most basic form: trust, awareness, and discipline. United Express Flight 5925, a Jetstream 41 turboprop operated by Great Lakes Airlines, approached Quincy on its final leg from Chicago. On board were 12 passengers and 2 crew, tired but relaxed. The captain, a former military pilot, was experienced with small airports like this. His co-pilot handled the radio, broadcasting calm and routine messages as they prepared to land on runway 4. The crew could see the intersecting runway 13 off to their right, faintly illuminated in the evening haze. At the same moment, on the ground, a Beechcraft King Air, a twin-engine private aircraft, was taxiing for takeoff with 2 pilots on board. They planned to depart on runway 13, the crossing runway. Both aircraft were on the same CTF frequency, both making calls. But in different rhythms, at different moments, their transmissions occasionally stepping on one another. The result was a deadly silence where understanding should have been. The jet stream called its position. Quincy traffic, United Express, 5925, 10 miles out, inbound for runway 4, full stop. The King Air responded moments later, announcing, Quincy traffic, King Air rolling on 13. But the timing was off. The United crew never heard the King Air's final takeoff call. The frequency had overlapped with another transmission, and their headsets caught only static. They believed the runway was clear. As United Express 5925 descended toward the field, passengers could see the faint runway lights flickering through the windshield. The landing was perfectly aligned, steady, precise. The jet stream touched down softly, its tires whispering against the asphalt. The captain began his landing roll, unaware that at that very instant, the King Air had started its takeoff run on the intersecting strip. The intersection point of runway 4 and runway 13 lay just ahead, invisible in the darkness. Neither crew could see the other. In the towerless silence of Quincy, both believed they had the right of way. At 70 knots, the jet stream's landing lights illuminated a blur of motion, the shape of another aircraft crossing from the right. The captain barely had time to shout before the impact. The jet stream slammed into the King Air's fuselage, tearing through it with brutal force. Fuel ignited instantly. A fireball engulfed both planes as they spun violently, coming to rest in a tangled heap at the intersection. There were no survivors. In the aftermath, investigators from the NTSB faced one of the most devastating truths in small airport aviation. Nothing had malfunctioned. Both aircraft were fully operational. Both crews had followed procedure as they understood it. The only missing piece was coordination, a shared understanding of who was where and when. The report concluded that a breakdown in CTAF communication had led to the collision. The King Air pilots had either not heard or not comprehended the United Express crew's landing call. The Jetstream pilots, in turn, had no indication that another plane was departing. The intersecting layout of the runways, combined with limited lighting, made visual detection impossible. This accident, though small in scale compared to major airline disasters, sent shockwaves through the aviation community. It revealed how vulnerable smaller, non-towered airports were, and how easily human error could thrive in the absence of oversight. Following Quincy, the FAA mandated improved CTAF procedures and stronger pilot training for non-towered operations. Pilots were instructed to make more frequent position calls, to use standardized phraseology, and to confirm visually before crossing or entering active runways. Many airports later installed radio-linked runway lighting systems and even automated advisories that broadcast traffic information to all inbound and outbound aircraft. But the lesson of Quincy was more than technical. It was human. It reminded every pilot that vigilance doesn't end when there's no one watching from the tower. In skies without control, communication becomes the only lifeline, and one missed word can erase every other precaution. No tower, no radar, no controller to warn them. Just two crews doing everything right. And one shared second of silence that changed everything. At Quincy, Illinois, aviation learned that in the absence of a tower, there can still be tragedy. Because in the fog of radio noise, there are no second chances. It was the morning of October 8th, 2001. Milan's Linate airport was shrouded in one of the thickest fogs northern Italy had seen in years. Visibility had dropped below 200 meters, barely enough to see the next taxiway sign. let alone another aircraft. On the runways, yellow lights blinked weakly through the grey haze. Controllers strained to keep track of aircraft they couldn't see, relying only on their voices over the radio and faith in the pilots navigating blind across the misty maze of asphalt. At 8:06 a.m., Scandinavian Airlines Flight 686, an MD-87 bound for Copenhagen, was cleared for takeoff on runway 36R. The jet's engines roared to life, vapor curling around its wings. The captain, a veteran of countless foggy departures, followed the center line, eyes locked on his instruments. At that same moment, a small Cessna Citation II business jet was taxiing toward the same runway. The two crews would never see each other until it was far too late. The Citation had been cleared to taxi toward runway 36R via a route known as Romeo 5, but the signage at Linate was confusing, old, partially obscured, and inconsistent with updated airport charts. Some signs were faded, others misaligned. Taxiway markings were hard to distinguish against the soaked concrete. The pilots, disoriented by the fog and struggling to confirm their location, took a wrong turn. Instead of holding short of the active runway, they continued past the stop line and entered runway 36R without realizing it. In the tower, the controllers couldn't see the mistake. Linate had no surface movement radar, no electronic eyes to track aircraft positions on the ground. To them, the Citation was still waiting where it should be. Seconds later, the MD-87 was cleared for takeoff. The jet accelerated, breaking through the fog at nearly full thrust. The pilots could barely see the runway ahead, trusting their instruments entirely. At 140 knots, the first officer spotted a shadow, a dark, unrecognizable shape directly ahead. There was no time to avoid it. The MD-87 slammed into the Cessna at full speed. The smaller jet disintegrated instantly, its wreckage torn apart under the larger plane's nose gear. The MD-87's left engine ingested debris, flames erupted, and the jet lost control, veering off the runway. Moments later, it careened into a luggage hangar, exploding into a massive fireball that engulfed everything inside. The impact killed 118 people, every passenger and crew member on both aircraft, plus 4 ground workers inside the hangar. It remains Italy's deadliest aviation accident. Investigators soon uncovered a devastating series of small failures. The airport's ground layout was outdated, its maps inconsistent with the actual markings. The taxiway that misled the Cessna had no proper lighting or painted stop bars. Radio phraseology was casual, lacking the standard readbacks that might have caught the error, and most critically, the lack of ground radar meant that controllers had no way to verify that the runway was clear before clearing the MD-87 for takeoff. The final report didn't blame a single person. It blamed a culture, one where visual assumptions were accepted in place of procedural verification. The Cessna crew was confused, the controllers were blind, and the airport itself had failed to keep up with international safety standards. The Milan disaster became a turning point for Europe's aviation infrastructure. Surface Movement Radar (SMR) systems and, later, ASDEX, were mandated for major airports operating in low visibility conditions. Taxiway markings were standardized across the continent. Airports introduced bright red stop bar lights at every runway entry, preventing aircraft from crossing active runways without explicit clearance. And phraseology, once flexible and informal, became rigidly standardized to avoid any chance of ambiguity. In the years that followed, Milan Linate rebuilt not just its infrastructure, but its philosophy of safety. Pilots now rehearse detailed low-visibility taxi briefings before every foggy departure. Controllers use radar screens to confirm every movement. And the lessons of that morning, the unseen collision between two crews separated by fog and a single wrong turn, are now taught in aviation schools worldwide. Invisible fog, invisible line, one small jet, one airliner, one moment of confusion, and one of the clearest lessons in ground safety the world has ever learned. It was the night of July 7th, 2017. San Francisco International Airport was quiet but busy, the kind of late-night rhythm that only major airports know. Most passengers had settled into the tired calm of red-eye flights. The fog, that familiar California curtain, had stayed offshore, leaving the runways clear but the lights hazy and distorted. Air Canada Flight 759, an Airbus A320 from Toronto, approached for landing on what the crew believed was runway 28R, one of SFO's parallel runways that stretched toward the dark waters of the bay. The descent was smooth, the approach stable. The captain and first officer exchanged quick, confident words. But what they saw ahead of them, the pattern of lights glowing in the night, was not what it seemed. A few hundred feet below their flight path, 4 fully loaded passenger jets were lined up nose to tail on taxiway C, waiting for clearance to depart. Their navigation lights blinked in steady rhythm, a constellation of aircraft engines and aluminum, parked and silent. From the air, in that imperfect light, the taxiway looked almost identical to the active runway beside it, and Air Canada 759 was heading straight for them. In the tower, the controller had cleared the A320 to land on runway 28R, which was indeed open and available. But for reasons that investigators would later call a perfect storm of perception, the crew had mistaken the adjacent taxiway for their intended runway. Fatigue was part of it. They had been awake for nearly 19 hours. The angle of the approach, the brightness of the taxiway lights, and the runway closures that week due to construction all played their roles. At just over 200 feet above the ground, a pilot from one of the waiting aircraft, a United 787, suddenly grabbed his radio. "Where's this guy going?" he shouted. His voice cut through the tower frequency. The Air Canada crew, still unaware of the danger, continued descending. The controller, realizing the trajectory was wrong, called out, "Air Canada 759, go around!" In the cockpit, the captain's eyes widened. Ahead, he could now see the row of aircraft beneath him, their tails glinting in the approach lights. "Go around! Go around!" the first officer shouted. The engines surged to full thrust, and the A320 clawed back into the night sky, missing the first plane by less than 30 feet. Had the go-around come 1 second later, the Airbus would have slammed directly into the lineup of 4 fully loaded passenger jets, a collision that could have killed over 1,000 people and become the deadliest accident in aviation history. In the aftermath, the NTSB launched a full-scale investigation. What they found was deeply unsettling. The Air Canada crew had not cross-checked their instruments with the runway alignment lights. Their fatigue had degraded situational awareness, and SFO's lighting configuration, with one runway closed and its lights turned off, created an optical illusion that even experienced pilots could fall victim to. The tower controller, managing multiple frequencies, had no ground radar view showing the aircraft's path. The incident became a wake-up call for modern aviation's dependence on visual approaches. Regulators reinforced procedures requiring precision-based navigation, RNP, or ILS guidance at night approaches whenever available, especially at airports with parallel runways. The FAA ordered changes to runway and taxiway lighting layouts to better distinguish them under all visibility conditions. New runway status warning systems were accelerated for installation, automatically alerting controllers when aircraft stray from assigned paths. Air Canada implemented stricter fatigue protocols, requiring rest adjustments for red-eye crews and increased emphasis on go-around decision training. The understanding that in any uncertainty, a go-around is not a failure but a life-saving act. Today, that 1-second decision, the moment when a tired crew realized what they were about to do, remains one of aviation's most haunting close calls. The video reconstructions, the cockpit data, and the voices on the radio all tell the same story. 1 second of error, 1 second of luck, and one miracle that turned disaster into a lesson. 4 planes, 1 taxiway, 1 second from disaster, and a reminder that in aviation, sometimes the greatest tragedies are the ones that almost happen. It was the early morning of February 4th, 2023. Thick fog rolled over Austin Bergstrom International Airport, swallowing the runways in a grey, shapeless wall. Visibility dropped to less than 1,000 feet, the kind of weather where even runway lights looked like distant stars. Air traffic controllers relied on instrument readings, not eyesight. Pilots trusted their procedures more than their instincts. But even in this world of precision, one small overlap, 2 clearances, 1 runway, nearly became the worst aviation disaster in modern US history. FedEx Flight 1432, a Boeing 767 cargo jet arriving from Memphis, was on approach to runway 18L. It was a routine mission, early morning, full of overnight parcels, flown by 2 experienced pilots. At the same time, Southwest Airlines Flight 708, a Boeing 737 carrying 128 passengers, was lined up at the same runway, waiting for takeoff clearance to Cancun. The tower was juggling both flights in near-zero visibility, their positions visible only as tiny blips on the radar. The FedEx crew checked in first. FedEx 1432 cleared to land, runway 18 left. Moments later, the controller cleared the Southwest crew for takeoff from the same runway, unaware that the FedEx 767 was less than a minute from touchdown. The words, spoken calmly, sealed a near tragedy. The FedEx pilots descended through the fog, eyes straining for any visual contact with the runway. Their altimeter ticked down, 500 feet, 400, 300. Then, through the mist, faint runway lights appeared. And something else. 2 glowing sets of strobe lights moving toward them. For a moment, their brains refused to process it. A plane, a passenger jet, was rolling for takeoff on the same runway they were seconds from landing on. "Southwest, abort!" the FedEx captain yelled over the frequency. "FedEx's on the go!" The 767's engines roared as he pulled back hard on the yoke. The aircraft pitched up, climbing sharply through the fog. Below, the Southwest 737, now aware of the chaos, kept accelerating, unaware of how close they truly were. Radar data later showed the 2 aircraft missed each other vertically by less than 100 feet, about the height of a single apartment building. The FedEx jet passed directly over the Southwest plane as it rotated for takeoff, disappearing back into the mist. From the tower, no one could see a thing. The only confirmation came seconds later when the FedEx pilot, his voice calm but edged with disbelief, said, "We were on the go," that Southwest was departing. Silence filled the frequency. Then, the controller's voice, stunned, broke through. "Roger, you were cleared to land on 18 left. Southwest was cleared for departure. I'll coordinate." It was one of the most chillingly understated exchanges in modern aviation. The near collision sent shockwaves through the industry. The FAA launched an immediate investigation, revealing a troubling reality. Even with advanced radar and strict procedures, human error can still slip through. The controller, managing multiple tasks, had lost situational separation between the 2 flights, a rare but deadly kind of cognitive overload. The fog had removed the last line of defense, visual confirmation. In response, the FAA accelerated new runway status lights, RDWSL, and ASDE-X safety net systems across major airports, automated tools that warn both controllers and pilots if 2 aircraft are cleared for the same runway. Airlines reinforced low visibility, low RVR protocols, requiring both pilots and controllers to double verify every clearance during fog operations. FedEx even released cockpit video training based on this event, turning it into a global case study for situational awareness and assertive communication. But beyond the procedures, this event became a testament to composure. The FedEx captain's split-second decision to reject the landing and climb out prevented what could have been the deadliest runway collision in US history. In the calm after the chaos, the pilot's voice captured the weight of it all. That could have been it. Same runway, same second. One decision that separated ordinary routine from unimaginable disaster. It was January 13th, 2023. A cold, clear evening at New York's JFK International Airport. The rush of departing flights filled the air, a symphony of engines and tower voices guiding aircraft into the night. On runway 4L, Delta Airlines Flight 1943, a Boeing 737 bound for Santo Domingo, waited for takeoff clearance. Everything was routine. Checklist complete, engines stable, runway confirmed. But on a parallel taxiway, American Airlines Flight 106, a Boeing 777 preparing for departure to London, made a wrong turn. Instead of following taxiway Kilo, it turned onto taxiway Juliet, a route that led straight across the active runway where Delta was about to accelerate to takeoff speed. Inside the cockpit of the American jet, the pilots were unaware of the danger. Inside the Delta jet, the crew was seconds away from the most critical decision of their careers. The tower cleared Delta for takeoff. The captain advanced the throttles, and the 737 surged forward, engines roaring. The aircraft reached 80 knots, then 100, accelerating fast. From the cockpit, nothing seemed unusual. Ahead, the runway lights stretched out in a glowing line. Then, out of the corner of the first officer's eye, something moved. Faint lights cutting across the darkness. At 140 knots, just seconds before rotation, the tower's voice suddenly broke through. Delta 1943, cancel takeoff clearance, the first officer shouted. Abort! Abort! The captain slammed the throttles to idle and stomped on the brakes. The anti-skid screamed. Passengers felt their bodies lurch forward as the plane shook violently, decelerating down the icy runway. When it stopped just past the intersection, the crew could see the silhouette of a massive Boeing 777 crossing in front of them, close enough that the tower gasped over the frequency. The Delta jet had stopped barely 1,000 feet from where the American plane crossed. A few seconds more, or a moment's hesitation, and the result could have mirrored Tenerife 1977. 2 heavy jets, 1 runway, and a disaster for the history books. The controllers went silent for a moment, then the radio crackled. Delta 1943, you're all right to exit when able. The captain, steady but firm, replied, Roger, we'll need a minute. That tone, calm, professional, but edged with what-ifs, captured everything aviation safety stands for, the power of training when instinct isn't enough. Investigators later found that the American crew had misinterpreted a taxi clearance. The complexity of JFK's ground layout, a web of runways and parallel taxiways, combined with fast radio exchanges, had created a moment of confusion. But that single wrong turn could have cost hundreds of lives. Technology prevented it from becoming tragedy. The ASDEX ground radar system, installed at JFK, detected the conflict almost instantly, triggering an alarm in the tower seconds before the Delta jet reached rotation speed. That automated alert gave the controller the time and the words to save 2 airplanes. The Delta crew's quick reaction sealed the miracle. Following the incident, the FAA re-emphasized the use of progressive taxi instructions for complex airports, stricter stop bar lighting activation, and enhanced pilot training on situational awareness at night. For Delta, the event became a model for decisive leadership, how milliseconds and teamwork can mean the difference between a close call and catastrophe. When the story became public, passengers on board later said they hadn't realized how close they had come to disaster. Only that the plane had stopped hard and the captain's voice had sounded different. That difference was the sound of experience, of someone who understood that in aviation, speed means nothing if you're heading toward the wrong runway. At 140 knots, a voice said, "Runway!" And that one word saved hundreds of lives. Every story you've heard tonight, from fog-covered runways to split-second decisions, reminds us that aviation is not built on perfection. It's built on awareness, communication, and the willingness to stop when everything says go. Each near miss, each hard-learned lesson became part of the system that keeps millions of people safe every day. If you've enjoyed exploring these moments where calm met chaos, where human judgment met fate, make sure to subscribe to Terra Obscura and like this video. Because here, we don't just tell the stories of planes that flew. We remember the moments when the world held its breath and someone made the right call. Every light, every word, every heartbeat matters. Because in aviation, safety is never an accident.